Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for our Artist and Album Google Hangout feature with Jesse Cook. Jesse Cook is a Canadian guitarist, composer, and producer. Widely considered one of the most influential figures in Nuevo Flamenco music, Jesse incorporates elements of flamenco, rumba, jazz, and various forms of world music into his work. An 11-time Juno Award winner, Jesse is also the recipient of Acoustic Guitar Magazine's Player's Choice Award Silver winner in the flamenco category, and is a 3-time winner of the Canadian Smooth Jazz Award for Guitarist of the Year. He has recorded on the EMI, eOne Music, and Nareda labels, and has sold over 1.5 million records worldwide. We're so excited to have Jesse in our Google Hangout today to discuss his latest album, One World, and some more aspects of his career. Over to you, Max.
Hey, Jesse, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thank you for joining us today on the Hangout on our Artist and Album feature, featuring you and your wonderful new eOne recording, One World.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Why don't we start off by talking about the title of the album? How did you arrive at the title? What was the inspiration for that?
The idea of One World for me was that notion that, music, if you look at the cover of the album, you'll see that there's a tree, a picture of a tree, and it's the idea that, all these different types of world music, whether we're talking about East Indian sitar, or whether we're talking about rumba flamenco guitar, or, Latin percussion, or Brazilian percussion, or African percussion, or whatever, all of these different elements that we're squeezing in, that they're all part of one world, the world of music. They're as if they're branches of the same tree, which is how we ended up with that image.
And you're a very prolific artist. You tour quite a bit and you've recorded quite a bit. This seems to be an album that gets a little bit outside of some of the things that you've done before. There's a little bit more production values on this, and it seems to have a little bit more of a world music element. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, certainly, there's been a lot of world music on my previous records. There's always been, elements of certainly flamenco mixed with jazz and a bit of pop. There have been some explorations, for example, in Nomad. I went to Cairo and recorded with musicians there, so, mixing my weird way of playing the guitar with Egyptian musicians. On the Rumba Foundation, I went to Colombia and recorded with musicians there. I also recorded with some Cuban musicians. So there have always been elements of world music, but on this one, I think I pulled the focus back further so that they're all kind of freely mixing in one space. And also the computer element is much more present. So I started working with samples and loops and electronica. Adding very sort of modern kind of post-industrial sounds. The sound of machinery and clanking and that sort of thing. Because I sort of feel like it's more compelling somehow if you've got an Armenian duduk, which is one of the oldest instruments that is still being played on the planet. It's, I think, 3,000 years old or something. The great-great-grandfather of the saxophone, and then you mix it with ultra-modern electronica, and it's that sort of compression of time that makes it somehow compelling. I think if it was just a duduk recording, it'd be beautiful, but it would sort of sound almost like I was doing some sort of anthropological study. Here we are studying this ancient instrument, but when you put it in a modern context, suddenly you realize just how timeless it is, that it and also how timeless music is, really.
Now, I hate to do this to you because I know that all of the tracks, there are 11 terrific tracks on the album, and they must all be like children to me. But I was hoping you might be able to talk about the 2 or 3 that, stand out for you in one way or another. They're all great, but, just maybe, 2 or 3 that have good stories attached to them.
Okay. Wow. Where do I start? Well, I think Bombay Slam is one of my favorites because it's got that thing. I'm always trying to take all of my favorite elements. It's like cooking a stew. You sort of think, what do I want to put in my stew? All my favorite foods. And I wanted to do that with Bombay Slam. I wanted to take, the sort of very kind of heavy urban grooves and Bootsy Collins kind of bass lines. And also I grew up in the 80s. I was a bit of a break dancer, and I kind of like that sort of hip hop feel. And then I wanted to add that into that elements of my weird style of guitar playing, but also there's some sitar on that track. There's a Bombay string section, like a Bollywood string section. What else is in there? There's oud. There's the Armenian duduk, which I mentioned before. There's just all sort of different kind of favorites of mine, different types of favorite music, different favorite instruments, and I sort of put them all in one place and thought, well, let's see what happens. See if they can all sit in the same track at the same time. So that one's certainly a favorite one. Trying to think of what some of the other songs are. There's Beneath Your Skin, which we talked about earlier, which is it's
one that I think you seem to have plenty to say about is Steampunk Rickshaw.
Yeah, well, Steampunk Rickshaw is kind of like Bombay Slam a little bit. That it's a similar thing. It's taking a lot of the same kind of world elements and putting them all together. Steampunk Rickshaw seems to take it further. For one thing, it's a longer piece of music. It starts in a very kind of quiet, isolated place. You almost feel like you're in the desert or something, and there's kind of a much more spacious opening, and there's elements of electronica, but there's also these very sort of traditional percussion instruments playing. And then by the end of Steampunk Rickshaw, it feels like you've traveled a huge distance, and you ended up, in I don't know, in Mumbai or somewhere. That by the end, there's this whole Bollywood string section joins you, and it's kind of taking you on a bit of a journey. And for me, I love those kind of records. I love the kind of records that you start one place and you end somewhere totally different. I probably, one of the first records that I had or experienced that was like that for me was Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd when I was a kid. That album just lived on my turntable, and it's the kind of thing, you could turn off all the lights in your house and just travel with it and play it really loud. And that's what I hope people would do with my record is crank it up loud and turn off the lights and go on a trip.
Yep. Now you're touring the album, of course, and how's the tour going?
It's been great. It's been pretty remarkable thus far. We've done the sort of larger cities in Canada, and up here the album debuted at #1 on the jazz charts, which completely shocked me because I don't think of it as jazz music, but I'm honored to be on that chart. But also simultaneously it was on the world chart. So I think it's that thing that my whole career, I've never really known where to put my music. That there's elements of all sorts of different things in it, but it doesn't sit neatly in any one genre, which I guess it's a good thing. It means I'm making something new, but at the same time, I every time I come up with a new record, I'm scratching my head, going, "What do we do with this?" But anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. So yes, we've been touring across Canada, and it's been a lot of fun. We're going to be playing the Montreal Jazz Festival, 2 nights at the Montreal Jazz Festival over the summer. And then we will be playing the Pan Am Games as well, but then also in the fall we'll be coming to the States. We'll be touring in parts of California and Arizona, more Canadian touring in the fall, and then in the spring of 2016 we'll be down in the States for months and months touring.
And how do you work it when you've got a new album and you're on tour and you want to satisfy audiences? How much of the new album do you play in a show?
Well, that's the tricky thing, because you realize when people come to see you, now that I have 9 CDs, they may only have 1 of those CDs, and if I don't play one song they know that night, if they get through the whole evening and they haven't heard one song that they're familiar with, they're probably going to hate me. So I try to keep my sets, being having a variety of different songs from different CDs, but also, I want to play material from the new CD as well. So usually I'll just try and strike that balance, and I mean, it's funny too, because the music that I'm doing, obviously, it's a little off the beaten path. It's not. This isn't pop music. You don't get that kind of blanket coverage that a pop song does. So, and yet, despite that, I have songs that we kind of jokingly refer to them as our hits, but they're the they're the ones that are the sort of favorite songs of our crowd, of our people who come to our shows, like Mario Takes a Walk, or Cafe Mocha, or Fall at Your Feet, or Tempest, or Dance of Spring, and they're all these songs that by the time you have 9 CDs, there are a lot of songs that people really want to hear, and I want to get to those songs, but I also want to be able to keep changing the show and playing new material. So, I think there are certain songs I have to play them every night. Mary Takes a Walk, I got to play that. And then there are other songs where I kind of play with it from time to time. We'll add a new song here and there. We'll try something out, or maybe a guest will show up and we'll sing a song with them. So that's how we do it. I don't know if that's clear at all. I don't know if I helped.
Now, you are one of the most influential figures, shall we say, in Nuevo Flamenco music. When did you first get introduced to it? I know you were born in Paris and you spent time in Paris and southern France and Barcelona. Did that have something to do with your introduction to this music?
Well, I think it had to, because how else do you explain it? I grew up mostly here in Toronto, in Canada, and growing up in the 70s and 80s, you didn't hear a lot of flamenco music in Toronto. For myself, the fact that I was born in France, that my parents had these Manitas de Platas records when I was very young, the fact that my dad later retired to Arles in the south of France, where his house was right in the middle of the Gypsy barrio. At the end of his street was a parking lot where the sort of a local gypsy group had their Winnebagos sort of parked, and it's just like the movies. They actually they have the clothesline between the Winnebagos and the fire at night, and people are out playing guitars. Except it's it's the 20th century, or it was the 20th century now. Now obviously it's 21st century, and they're still doing that. But as a kid from Canada, sort of spending my summers with my dad to arrive in this town where it was like a picture book. I mean, kids would be walking down the street strumming the guitar, treating it like a percussion instrument. It was very exciting, and I guess the only other reason, the other influences were probably my first guitar teacher in Toronto happened to be a flamenco teacher, so some of the first pieces I learned were flamenco. But then as I got better at the Guitar Academy, they passed me on to the classical teachers who were, the quote-unquote better teachers. But by the time I was 13, I was kind of frustrated with that repertoire, and I wanted to get into other things, so I quit and got into jazz and more flamenco. And then, of course, the last and probably the biggest influence was Paco de Lucia. There was an album, Friday Night in San Francisco, where Paco plays with John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola, and there was this sort of hybrid fusion of jazz and flamenco and improvising and just playing at a crazy breakneck speed. And as a teenager, that sort of pushed all my buttons, and I thought that's what I want to do. That's how I want to play the guitar.
Now, is it true that one of those summers visiting your father, you found out that one of his neighbors is Nicholas Reyes?
Yeah.
Gypsy Kings, and you played with those guys when you were a teenager?
Yeah, I think I was in my late teens. The Gypsy Kings still weren't kind of world famous. They weren't this sort of internationally renowned band. They were just a local band. And, my dad was playing me their record, saying, you should hear these guys, they're great. And I remember we were downstairs in his kitchen, and when the record finished, we heard what we thought was somebody else playing the same record, and we realized, no, that's actually live. That's real. People are, playing that. You could hear people talking over it, stopping and starting, and it sounded like it was coming from the roof. So we went to the roof of my dad's house. And keep in mind, in a lot of European cities, there's no front yards or backyards. There'll be a little courtyard behind your house, but mostly people go up to their rooftop patios. So on the rooftop patio, we looked over in there, and the neighbor's roof, there was this gypsy jamboree going on. People were dancing and singing, and the guitars were out. So my dad said, quick, get your guitar. So I ran downstairs, I grabbed my guitar, and when they finished their song, strummed a chord, and they all went, hey, man, and the next thing you know, I was jamming with the Gypsy Kings, it was pretty exciting. Again, to sort of be a Canadian kid and find yourself in that environment. And then a few years later, when they kind of took the world by storm, it was even crazier when you realize, oh my God, I played with those guys.
That's a great story. Would you say the culmination in some ways? Was the Rumba Foundation recording the culmination of your flamenco roots?
Well, the Rumba Foundation sort of explores. I don't know how much detail you want to go into in the answer, but in flamenco music, I realize that I should sort of probably define my terms. That a lot of people refer to flamenco as pretty much anything Latin sounding. You know, people are often listening to tango music and they go, oh, flamenco or salsa. But flamenco is actually something very specific. It is the music of the gypsies of Spain, probably specifically southern Spain, Andalusia. And there are many forms within traditional flamenco music. There's bulerías, soleá, seguerías, fandango de Huelva. There's all these different forms, and there's traditions about how those forms are played. You know, llamadas that are used to call in the singer or the dancer. It's all part of a kind of a way of communicating music when performing live as part of flamenco music. And they believe that sometime in the 1800s, there were some new forms that sort of joined the flamenco vernacular, and those were called ida y vuelta forms, which were sort of round-trip forms. And what that meant was that the sailors, who at that time were, going back and forth between the New World and Spain, would come back from having visited Cuba, and they'd be hanging out, in a bar in some seaport with gypsies, and they'd say, wow, we're in Cuba and we heard this rhythm called the rumba, you should hear it, and it goes like this, and maybe they'd play like the clave, so it'd be like tac, 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 or tac. And then, the gypsies kind of heard that and thought, well, that's pretty cool, and they kind of looped it, so they went bang, and then rumba flamenco was born. And there are many forms like that have their roots from South America or Latin America or the Caribbean. And so I guess what I was doing with the Rumba Foundation was just experimenting with playing with music today in those parts of the world, taking my rumba flamenca and mixing it with, vallenato music from Colombia or with Cuban musicians, and just seeing what does it sound like when you put those things together today. Again, it's that idea like these are branches from the same tree. Maybe they parted ways in the 1800s, but what happens if we put them back together today?
Right, and you traveled to Cuba and to Colombia to really get into, get with the people and do your research.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, I traveled to Colombia. The Cuban musicians I actually worked with in Canada because, luckily, in my band, there's a musician named Chandy Leon who moved to Canada in not that long ago, and he brought his parents with him, and his father is a great old percussionist from Cuba, and he plays in that sort of son style, that kind of Buena Vista Social Club era of Cuban music. So I worked with Chandy and his father, Chandy Sr., on the record. But yeah, in Colombia I worked with a group called Los Gaiteros de San Jacinto. And those guys play traditional gaita music, which is they're like heroes in Colombia. Their music is actually recorded and held in the Smithsonian Institute as sort of part of the national heritage of Colombia. And they live in the north. They make all their instruments by hand. And they came down to Bogota to record with me in a studio there, and it was pretty amazing experience. I mean, it was one of those magical things where you kind of have to pinch yourself and go, how did I end up here? How did this happen, At the end of the session, they presented me with these beautiful gaita flutes that they'd made by hand, and then I had to try and figure out how to get those back to Canada, get them through customs, Where are they from? Colombia? No, you can't bring those in. You know how it works, so.
You've had great commercial success in your career. You've sold millions of records, and your music's been used a lot on TV, different programs, and your music's been used in the Olympics and for some of the dance shows and Sex and the City. And how would you characterize what it's like to have your music used for television?
Oh, you know what? It's great. Actually, the one you didn't mention was a huge Bollywood hit called Doom, which I found out about it because a fan in India wrote me an email one day saying, I just wanted to tell you how much I love your Bollywood hits. And I was like, what? Sorry, come again. But yeah, there was a song called Doom Doom Doom, I think. The movie was called Doom, and the song was Doom Doom, DHOOM. And it was huge. Yeah, I think it grossed 36 million euros in its first few weekends, and it was actually a big, big song. Launched like 4 or 5 sequels, and the main song was my song, Mario Takes a Walk. And to sort of see your music go on and have a life of its own, and be part of, another, be sort of embraced by another culture, and become so successful like that was kind of remarkable. I mean, it's wonderful. Or to see your music in the Olympics. Most of the time when these things happen, I'm the last person to hear about it. I'll get a call from my aunt or my mother or somebody, and they'll say, "Oh my God, I was watching the Olympics." And so yeah, it is really great. I mean, I think as an artist, you produce these little melodies, and it's just you and the music, and you sort of think, will anybody ever hear this? Will it ever mean anything to anybody? And and then you release it to the world, and you just hope somebody will hear it, that somebody will care, and for it to actually go out and have a life like it has, I'm thrilled.
Now, I hear the big commercial break in your career was the 1995 Catalina Jazz Festival, and there's an interesting story attached to that.
Yeah, well, it was one of those things where it was the spark we needed, at a certain point in my career. I had made, in '95, I created Tempest independently. I recorded it at home. I had some time on my hand. In my 20s, I was a composer. I had a recording studio, and I would compose music for whatever, television or theater or dance, whatever people needed. And I made Tempest really just as a kind of a pet project. Just one of those things where I was 29, and I had a friend saying, you should record your guitar music. And I thought, well, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it, and then I'll wonder, what if. So I made the record, and it was back in those days when you could go to a factory and say, can you manufacture 500? And they say, well, for not that much more, you can get 1,000. And I thought, oh God, 1,000. They'll be in my basement forever. I'll be using them, as Christmas presents. My grandmother, oh, a CD again, how nice, And so the CD came out. And immediately it sold, I think, right out across the country. My first 1,000 were gone, and I was shocked. Like I couldn't imagine that people were interested. So we made another 2,000, and immediately those sold out. Around the same time, we got interest from 3 record labels in the United States. We signed with Narada, and it was one of those things where it just all seemed a bit kind of dreamlike to me. I didn't really believe any of this was happening. I just sort of thought, yeah, we'll see, we'll sign, I don't know. And I remember the president of Narada was saying, listen, we want you to go and play at the Catalina Jazz Festival in California. And I remember trying to talk him out of it. I remember saying to him, oh, you know what, people aren't going to want to see this live. It's nice to listen to it in your living room, but who's going to want to watch me, noodling around on the guitar and live, right? What's that? And anyway, he convinced me, so we went down for the weekend. And of course, it was very last minute, and the festival had been booked out. So there were no places, there were no sort of main stages available. We played in a little bar downstairs, and I remember during the intermission, we were supposed to play. So when people would come down to have a drink or two, we would get out the guitars and start playing. And at first I was thinking, oh, this is gonna be like a lounge gig. How did I end up here? And instead, people got in there and they were like dancing and really excited. And we'd finish the song, and more people would pack into the bar. And eventually, outside of the bar, people were sort of jammed in trying to see. And then there was this ramp that went upstairs to the main stage, and that was full of people. And my 20 minutes were up, and I sort of said, look, okay, the show's about to begin. You need to go back upstairs. And people kept giving us more and more encores, and they wouldn't let us stop. And finally, by the end of the weekend, they invited us up to the main stage for I guess they called it the All-Star Jam. And I remember Art Good, who ran the festival, stood up on the stage and he said, well, by popular demand from downstairs at the bar, please welcome. And before he even said my name, the whole audience stood up, and we got this 10-minute standing ovation. It was crazy. It was one of those moments where I realized, wow, I guess I'm going to have to quit my day job. I think my life is about to change. And I got back to Toronto, and I got a call that Monday from the head of the label saying, Wow, a store in Catalina, a little variety store, just ordered 10,000 copies of your CD, and your CD has just debuted at number 14 on the Billboard charts, and I was in shock. I mean, it was one of those things where, I'd never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that anything like that was going to happen.
Wow, unbelievable. Well, Jesse, I really appreciate you coming on today for our artist and album chat. Thanks so much. Love the record. It's doing great at radio. We're having a ball working it, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Great talking with you.
Back to you, Amanda.
Yes, it was so great having you on the Hangout, Jesse. Thank you so much. So for those of you watching, you can feel free to watch this Hangout over again if you want to see it again on our Crossover Media YouTube page. Our username is crossovermedianet. And we also have a very active website that we update daily with music news and artist news and radio news as well, and that's at crossovermedia.net. And you can also access our Facebook, Twitter, and our SoundCloud with a lot of interview material in the upper right-hand corner on our homepage. So thanks again for watching, and see you next time.